So does every Warhammer game need to be a 3 or 4 hour clash of 2,000 point armies? What are the pros and cons of playing smaller games of Warhammer 40k? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics for a bit of a discussion related video. I've been requested quite a few times on the channel now to talk about small games and combat patrol, so today I thought we'd finally get round to doing that. In the video we'll talk about a few ways that you can play smaller games of 40k, and then talk about some of the positives of these small games and some of the potential drawbacks compared with bigger battles. I think there's definitely some pros and cons to playing with some smaller, more skirmish style armies, and a fair few of the ideas here come from a community post I made a few days back asking for your opinions and feedback in small games of 40k. In any case, let's jump straight into it and talk about skirmish size armies. So one of the new selling points of 9th edition when it came out was that they were going to try and make legitimate efforts to balance the game at different levels and try and make 40k proper playable from anything from 500 points all the way up to much bigger battles. When the 9th edition previews were coming out, Combat Patrol was made quite a big deal of, and the 500 point or 25 power level missions specifically made for a smaller battlefield size, and often with not quite as many objectives on the board, so it doesn't just become a game of who has the most multiple small units to take all the points. I think it really is in Games Workshop's interest to try and make small games playable, as of course that's what people tend to start out when they have smaller collections, and these are often likely to be people's first tastes of Warhammer 40k as they're learning the rules and building up their armies. The Combat Patrol forces will tend to be at least fairly small indeed for actual 40k. It does kind of depend on your army a bit, but you might not really have all that many units to play with. Depending on how meaty your units are, you're going to have somewhere typically between 3 and 8 units on the board, so tactical options and interactions are going to be a bit limited. Incursion style games, maybe around about 1,000 points, perhaps don't get quite as much attention as they perhaps should. I feel like they're a fairly decent halfway point between saving time and playing games quicker, while adding in a little bit more unit variety, and perhaps making the gaming experience a bit more balanced than the smallest Combat Patrol games. Of course, if you are looking to play very small skirmish style games of 40k, you might well want to give Kill Team a look. I'm sure most people will be aware that there's a fairly new edition of the rules out, and it's very easy to put a force together, only needing a squad or two to play the game. It's definitely a very solid alternative to things like Combat Patrol, and maybe feel like the rules are a bit more designed for skirmish games, as opposed to trying to cram full-scale 40k down into a points level that it maybe wasn't really intended for. If you want to play some really quite quick games where every model matters, Kill Team might be something that you want to look into. I think the main reason that I've never really got into it is having to learn an entire different rule set, where I feel like I have quite enough to be going on with full-scale 40k at the moment. In any case though, if we are playing full-scale 40k, let's talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages of playing small Combat Patrol size games as opposed to playing big 2,000 point battles. Starting out, let's talk about the positives of small games, and obviously the really big win is time. If you're only playing with small forces that you only need to command a certain amount of units for, you're pretty well guaranteed to be able to play far more games in a day or in an evening. If you meet up with someone, you might not just be able to play one game of 40k, you might be able to play 2 games of Combat Patrol in that same time, maybe resetting and even tweaking the armies a bit in the interim. Very few people have as much hobby time as they'd like. Unfortunately, real life does have a habit of getting in the way, and sometimes it might be easier to escape for a game of Combat Patrol than it would be to commit entire evenings or days to playing 2,000 point games of 40k. For a lot of people, playing Combat Patrol might be the only real option, at least the vast majority of their working weeks. Barriers to entry for Combat Patrol and small games of 40k are so much lower than big games as well. Both the time assembling and painting your miniatures, and also the money you're likely to spend getting them together, will be significantly smaller. Games Workshop really are trying to make it easy for people to play these. Just grab your faction's Combat Patrol if you have one in 9th, and you should be ready to go right out of one box if all you want to do is jump into 40k and play these little games. It really is the best way to learn 40k and break into the hobby in general. Most newer players are going to have quite enough going on in their minds to occupy them on a small game, as opposed to trying to command a full 2,000 point army straight away. Trying to do that in your first few games is quite likely to be information overload. Also, commitment to the actual board itself won't have to be quite as big. You'd need less space and less terrain needed to make a decent gaming table. I think Games Workshop fully intended Combat Patrol to be playable on something like a kitchen or dining room table, and setting up and taking down a board can be relatively quick and accessible to most people even if they have fairly limited space in their houses. With only a few units in the board in Combat Patrol, it can be quite a dynamic and punchy little game. In a big battle it might be kind of irrelevant to the grand scheme of things if any one squad triumphs over any other, but with only a few units on the board, each unit and dice roll matters a lot. and as you have relatively fewer choices to make in the game, all of those choices are going to matter so much more. There's perhaps a little bit more scope for squad level heroics, with individual sergeants or minor characters really stepping up to try and carry the day. Finally, it can just be fun for the sheer variety of play and getting a different experience out of the game. 500 point and 2000 point 40k plays very differently. Different units and combinations will be effective and threatening compared with in a full 2000 point army. It can just be a different way to use your army and maybe have different units be better and trying to meet up to a different tactical challenge on the board. I feel like it's also less of an investment if you're experimenting with some random combinations or units that you don't use very much. If you're committing to a big 3 or 4 hour game of 40k, you might not really want to be using units that are going to slightly underperform or might just do nothing. But with the relatively lower time investment that is a game of combat patrol, it might not be such a bad thing if your army does have a chance of getting completely wiped and could allow you to just be a bit more random with some fun combos. Overall, I'd say the main advantage of combat patrol are that it's generally a lot easier to play both in terms of time and miniatures required, and basically scales down 40k to a bit more of a punchy and dynamic version of itself, with the focus just being on a few squads and individuals. For all that good stuff though, there are a few potential negatives in combat patrol. The main one being that it's really quite swingy, and I'd argue is a far less balanced or competitive game than the bigger 2000 point games of 40k. Basically, the more points that an army has available, generally the more units and combinations that you can take that will better be able to counter what the enemy has to throw at you. It's a bit easier to balance things between objective holding, screening, anti-tank and anti-infantry duties, whereas in combat patrol, you're likely to be lacking in at least some of those areas, or say if you lose a unit early in the game, you might just not have any answer whatsoever to one of the enemy's threats for the rest of the battle. It means that if you really are trying to build competitively in combat patrol, things like extreme skew lists will do very well indeed, just overloading the enemy with one very efficient target, whether that's tons of good infantry, a ton of light vehicles, or a massive single unit threat that the opponent is really going to struggle to counter. Even if no one is trying to build anything too weird, it's still often going to be quite possible to predict who's going to win the game before it even begins, just by seeing who's got what answers to which formations of your opponents. To add to that, in smaller games luck is going to be more of a factor than in big games of 40k. As each dice roll matters so much more, if you get unlucky on a couple of rolls, it could actually easily make the difference between victory or defeat. Losing a key character due to bad luck in a big game of 40k isn't the worst thing if you've got 3 or 4 on the table. Losing that same character due to bad luck in combat patrol could be absolutely devastating if you just have the one. For that reason, I generally encourage most people not to play combat patrol games hyper-competitively, or at least not unless you're playing against a friend who's a very similar mindset, and you both have access to armies that can put some silly things on the table. I've heard plenty of people introducing small house rules to make combat patrol games flow a bit better, saying that you can't have a unit that's any more than 200 points, or just having gentlemen's agreements to bring fairly balanced armies for some more interesting unit interaction rather than just spam. I think there's obvious reasons that you don't tend to see tournaments based around combat patrol games. While it's still fun to try and outcommand your opponents, if you want to play more competitively, I would advise bigger games myself. I'd say that's perhaps the main downside of combat patrol and small games. Maybe other small criticisms might be that it's a bit less of a spectacle compared with seeing 2 massive fully painted armies go toe to toe, and some people just like to be able to use all their collection if they have already built up to that sort of points level. I guess it just depends on what you're looking to get out of a game of 40k. Finally, in sort of a similar vein, if just playing combat patrol, there will be a fair few units and army builds that just aren't really very viable at a small game level. You're not going to be able to build any sort of balanced army that includes things like the Silent King or Mortarion, as that's 90% of your points gone in one fell swoop, and certain armies that rely on things like synergy characters to make up for slightly lackluster unit profiles just won't be as strong either. Say for example, if you spend 300 points on buffing characters in a 2000 point list, they could have quite a lot of army to buff and make better, whereas if you do the same in a combat patrol list, you're best off just taking more basic squads and grunts, as there's no point in investing loads of points in buffing characters to buff a tiny part of your remaining force. I think maybe combat patrol works a little bit better for some of the less elite armies in 40k as well. If you're playing armies like knights or custodians, the factions do have the risk of becoming really quite monodimensional. You're not going to be able to get many units out of them, and then it might just become a game of whether or not your opponent can kill those units before they get deleted by them. It's not always the worst thing to restrict some powerful options, particularly at smaller games, but some codexes might have more trouble with that than others, and some people might want the incentive to use some of their bigger models or synergy pieces, which often doesn't really make sense to do in a combat patrol game. So overall, I think there's plenty of positives and negatives to playing smaller games of 40k. I'd say they work absolutely great as a quick way to get more games in, and if you're playing a bit more casually with some like-minded people, but you do miss out on some aspects of 40k. As you can probably tell, I do quite like building and designing strong armies and putting in together interesting combinations, and I feel that just becomes a bit more relevant at bigger games where maybe it's a bit more meaningful and things are at least somewhat more balanced. There's absolutely no reason why you can't mix and match both though, different games for different occasions. So let me know your thoughts and experiences with Combat Patrol and other small games of 40k. Look forward to hearing all your thoughts and ideas down in the comments below. Have you been enjoying Combat Patrol in 9th? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k content coming, with new videos out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention the Auspex Tactics Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description. Making all the content does take a fair amount of time, and if you are enjoying regularly, then any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.